Hey everyone, my name is Robin Lewis, and in this video I'm going to be making this mobile laundry island bench out of Vic Ash. I hope you find some of the tricks and tips in this video helpful. Let's jump in. I'm starting with the legs. All the boards are cut down the guts, so now to make a square piece of timber, I might just fold them in like that. But the keen-eyed among you might have noticed something, and you're saying, well, that would be ludicrous. If you look at the grain direction, this face is the face grain, and in this board's case, that is the outside of the tree, that's the inside of the tree. So if this grain is running in this direction, this grain is running in this direction. So if I fold it like that, I'm gonna end up with a face grain board where half of the grain's running that way and half of it's running that way. So to get around this, if I do this, I need to then flip this board around like that. Now, all of the grain is gonna be running in the same direction. Each of these legs requires a nut for the casters to screw into, and because they're essentially split in half, I can take advantage of this and route out the pockets in two different sections. Okay, so all of the pockets are cut where I can pop this threaded connector into, like that. Then I get the second leg, glue it on top, sandwich that in, and we're off to the races. The next step is the rails. I want them around 70 mil high and about 20 to 22 mil thick. The problem is the only stock I could get from my supplier is 35 millimeters. So to get around the problem, I'm going to take this 140 wide mil board, rip it straight down the middle. I'm then going to take 3 of those, glue them together. That way I'll have a blank of around 105 millimeters wide, and that can be cut into 4 separate strips. That way I can make the best use of this stock without wasting too much. This added quite a bit of extra time to the project, but because this isn't my full-time job yet, I can afford to spend that extra time because it's not actually costing me dollars and cents. And after all that milling, I'm left with my 2 top long rails. These ones are a bit thicker than the rest. These are 35 because they're going to be taking the stone top. The other 4 long rails. There's the 6 short rails. And lastly, the 4 legs. Everything's been run through the drum sander up to 80 grits. So the next step is to start the joinery. I'm using traditional mortise and tenon joinery for this project, and I've used this method a number of times. The process is pretty well rehearsed at this stage. I'll mark out for the mortises first, and then using a drill press, hog out the majority of the material. Once that's taken care of, I'll move over to a router to finalize that internal cut. To clean up the inside of this mortise, I'm going to be using my router, and I'm using a down cut spiral bit, so it's a nice clean sharp cut. You'll also notice I've got the fence set up on this side while I'm cutting this side of the inside of that face. That way, if the router jumps or if it pulls in one direction, it can't pull this way because the fence is stopping it. It can only move back towards the inside of the mortise. So I don't risk cutting into that nice inside face. Recently, I've started plunging with the router more than moving it back and forth through the cut. It feels a lot more controlled. So the idea is to plunge most of the material away and then come back and do the final back and forth pass, cleaning it up. With the mortises taken care of, I could move on to the tenon, and I used a knife to mark off exactly where I want that tenon to end, so all the rails are the same length. I removed the majority with a router, and I'm also using a fence to get even closer up to that line while still being safe and not going over it. And then I'll come back with a chisel and finalize it. So I'm fitting my tenons to the mortise, and I've already done a number of test cuts on some test pieces. But if there's ever any discrepancy along the process, I can just take a couple of layers off that tenon and get a really nice tight fit. I'm setting up to epoxy these nuts into this leg, and I thought I'd go over why I'm going this route. I haven't really explained that yet. So you may be asking yourself, well, why don't you just, instead of epoxying this nut in there, why don't you just simply take the wheel, drill a smaller hole, and epoxy the wheel in place? One of the things with this project is the client didn't specify what type of surface this island is going to be on. So I don't know what type of wheel I should be using. This is a pretty good all-rounder wheel, but by putting this M16 nut in here, they can replace the wheel for anything that they want. The other benefit is that if the wheel ever breaks or if it's damaged, they can simply pull it out and put in a new one. For this particular configuration, I'm doing 4 wheels. 2 of them have brakes, 2 of them don't. I think that should be all right. But again, if the client changes their mind, it's no drama, they can do that. I did a quick test fit to make sure that everything looked correct and all of the joins were tight enough, and then I could get to the very long process of rounding over all of the edges and sanding. The glue up for this was pretty straightforward. I started with the short ends first, so it was 3 rails into the 2 legs, pretty simple. But then when I moved on to gluing these 2 short pieces to the long pieces, it got a bit more complicated. Using a bit of creativity, I got there in the end, and this is also the first time that I'm using pipe clamps for a glue up, and I am sold. Considering the mechanism and how you can essentially extend your clamps as long as you want depending on the relatively cheap pipe, I think that the idea is fantastic, and I'll be using these a lot more in the future. Now, because this mobile island bench is mobile, there's going to be a desire to push it around and move it around. And as soon as you start adding force in the corners, it's going to want to push the entire piece out of square. Admittedly, the stone top will take a lot of that force, and that's not going to shift. But because of that stone top, I want to make sure that the flexible timber frame below it has as little movement as possible. So these corner braces work really well. They just lock everything in place. I also added a center rail to the top. This was just to add a little bit more support to the stone top to keep it in line with the manufacturer's specifications. It's probably a bit overkill, but I could put it in, and it's one of those things that helps me sleep at night. For this, I went back to the good old favorite oil-based wipe-on polyurethane. It feels like ages since I've used this finish, and I've kind of missed it. To attach the slats to the rails, I'm going to be using some exposed dowels. Exposing the dowels is obviously a look. Some people like it, some people don't, but it really made the process a lot simpler instead of trying to hide them. With the sides and underside of the slats finished, it was simply a case of attaching them in place. It was quite a straightforward process. The only thing I had to make sure of was that the overhang of the slats were the same on each side, so that when you sighted down all of the slats, they were in one continuous line. Using a combination square took care of this. For the end pieces, instead of trying to notch around them, I simply fitted them in place, and the gap between that first and second board was the same as the rest. So it looked pretty good and was very straightforward to do. So after some more finish, this project was complete, and I wish I had some better pictures for you guys to show you the end product, but unfortunately when I delivered it to the clients, they didn't have the stone ready. So this picture that you're looking at was taken a couple weeks later, and that was the best that I could get. My name is Robin Lewis. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you want to see more of this content, I want to encourage you to subscribe. Thanks again, and I'll see you guys in the next one.